And great, so we can officially welcome Incline High School. This is Nevada's wildcard team. Welcome to Unit 1. In just a moment, I will introduce your judges, or I'll have them introduce themselves. But to briefly introduce myself, my name is Emily Voss. I am the We the People coordinator for Virginia. It's great to be with you here today. Congratulations on making the top 12. So as I said, the judges will introduce themselves, and then they'll hand things to you to introduce yourselves and your teachers. And then they'll go ahead and proceed with reading your question, your prepared statement, and the follow-ups, of which you get 2 bonus minutes today. All right, so with that, let me go ahead and hand things over to your teachers, or your judges. There we go.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to be with you. My name is Miriam Marsadegi. I judge this every year. I was a participant in We the People the very first year it was offered, on the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution, long time ago. I currently serve on the board of the Center for Civic Education, and I've spent a good portion of my career providing opportunities for civic education and for people living in not free countries, including where I'm originally from, Iran.
Sue Leeson, Senior Justice, Oregon Supreme Court.
Tim Moore, Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin, and it's great to be here.
Could you introduce yourselves, please, and your teachers?
Hello, judges. My name is Brianna Salas. In addition to We the People, I have been enrolled in JROTC for 4 years, and I've been the Special Projects Officer for 2 years in a row.
Wow.
Hello, judges. My name is Laura Ann Moore, and in addition to We the People, I am a competitive equestrian, and next year I will be attending the University of the South in Tennessee.
Ooh.
Hello, judges. Good day. I'm Christian Schmenk, and after high school, I intend on studying political science and literature at Howard University. And we are joined here today with our teacher, Milton Himes, and our coaches, Amy Henderson Seitz and Michaela Tonking.
Pleasure to meet all of you. I'm going to read our question for today. Unit 1, Philosophical and Historical Foundations of the American Political System. It's question number 1 begins with a quote from Benjamin Rush. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? Please begin.
James Madison wrote in Federalist 14, Americans accomplished a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human society. The principles of the social contract, representation, and sovereignty that influenced constitution making were revolutionary because they created unprecedented change to socio-political thought that the founders had the audacity to put into practice. The most revolutionary change was the issue of sovereignty. The founders fundamentally changed where sovereignty lies, popularly in the people.
According to political scientist James McClellan, 1776 signifies the birth of constitutional government. For this was the first time in world history that a large group of communities began the formation of their own governments under written constitutions.
Every early state constitution was an experiment in designing the best constitution integrating these principles. The Pennsylvania Constitution stated that people have the right, by common consent, to change the government. The Delaware Constitution references the right of representation, stating issues of persons entrusted with the legislative and executive powers are the trustees and servants of the government.
The U.S. Constitution itself is an embodiment of the social contract. We can see the principles of consent and representation in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1, and Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1, which gave people popular sovereignty and representation in the social contract. The ultimate example of the social contract is found in Article 5's provisions of amending the Constitution, which gives power to the people to change their government when they see fit.
The principle of consent presents problems when creating or amending constitutions because of issues of representation and the renewal of consent. If people are not represented by their government, they cannot consent to it. Only white male property owners attended and were represented at the Constitutional Convention. If someone was not a white male property owner at this time, they could not consent to this government. Today, challenges to consent include a lack of diversity in Congress, voting restrictions, corporate lobbying, and gerrymandering.
When a new generation comes into power, they have yet to express their consent to be governed. Jefferson declared that a revolution and constitutional convention must occur at least once every generation, stating that past generations have neither powers nor rights over the earth.
Our revolutionary principles are evident today in social media, modern revolutions, and our amendment process. Social media is the new public square and is a vehicle for people to use their popular sovereignty to communicate their ideas, desires, and grievances to the government. For example, Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez holds question and answer sessions on her Instagram.
We can see examples of nonviolent revolutions that have renewed consent. For example, the people's push for the ratification of the 26th Amendment, the Keystone Pipeline protests, and the Black Lives Matter movement. The amendment process, as well as the principles of initiative, referendum, and recall, are the best ways that people can change their government. When the people propose an amendment, they are participating in revolutionary change by evolving the social contract.
In Nevada, an amendment must be approved twice in the general election in order to be passed. In 2020, amendments passed included the right to gay marriage, voter rights, and a clean energy initiative. Nationally, the push for amendments to make Washington, D.C. and U.S. territory states aim to expand representation and consent.
Our revolutionary principles continue to drive change that brings us closer to a more perfect union. Aristotle declared, in revolutions, the occasions may be trifling, but great interests are at stake. Thank you.
Okay, great. You spoke about social media. So I'm going to address it in terms of it being an opportunity to widen and improve and deepen consent. What about the problems of social media and the threats to democratic political life because of that?
I would certainly agree. We do have a lot of problems with social media. In Robert Putnam's bowling alone theory, their social capital already has been decreasing for 70 years, and social media only contributes to this by increasing social anxiety and lack of civil discourse. With social media, we see the problem of misinformation arising, and a direct consequence of this is the incident that happened on January 6th in the Capitol riots that I feel social media had a part in.
Furthermore,
Additionally, we can look to Rebecca McKinnon's book called Consent of the Networked, which explores the idea of consent and the social contract on social media. And something that I find really interesting is that she proposes something called digital due process, which would expand our rights and our pretty much what we want from our government in the social contract, but pretty much transfer it over to social media. And this would give us greater consent in our government and online.
If I could take us back to the 18th century for a few minutes. As I understand your theory, it's that the revolution really occurred in 1776 with what you call the birth of constitutional governments, which makes the Constitutional Convention of 1787 kind of an engineering project of trying to make some improvements in what we already have. Why did the proposed Constitution generate such a vehement response by the Anti-Federalists? And why was ratification such a dicey and even precarious process?
Yeah, so the main argument of the Anti-Federalists was that the Constitution proposed did not have a Bill of Rights. And according to Locke, we enter into a social contract to protect our rights. And so the Anti-Federalists believed that this was an injustice to the people because they had just fought a whole war trying to get their rights secured to them. And then the Bill of Rights was not included in the Constitution.
Well, and I'm going to argue with you there by pushing you to tell me what else they thought about, because the Bill of Rights argument was a throwaway for them, which many of the writers have conceded. What were their fundamental core objections to the Constitution?
Definitely the principles of the federal government versus the states. The anti-federalists wanted, they did not want the Congress or the executive to have as much power as they did under the new Constitution. And so this resulted in the creation of the two parts of Congress, the House and the Senate, because the anti-federalists did not agree with only having the House.
Yeah, and this is also reflected in the failed Articles of Confederation, which gave states vastly too much power over the federal government, which therefore served as a detriment as the federal government could not rally or raise funds as Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution actually declares it can to promote the general welfare.
Do you think there's a difference, maybe there isn't, I don't know, between a revolution and a reform movement?
Definitely. We can look to British historian Alan Bullock's definition of a revolution, which is the change in political power and political thought in the socio-political landscape due to revolt by the people. And this causes a sudden change in fundamentals. And
furthermore, we can also look to the Declaration of Independence drafted by Thomas Jefferson, who is a firm believer in Epicurean belief, which was founded on the general happiness principle, which promotes welfare and pleasure for all people. And it served as a promissory note for all people to be able to exercise their inalienable rights equally. And this itself was revolutionary and compared to the stark contrast of tyrannical monarchies and aristocracies prior. And the reform movements that you alluded to are more along the lines of the suffragette movement as
Right, and that's exactly. That's why I asked. That's why I'm asking, is there a difference between revolutions and reform, where a lot of your argument is about reform movements, suffrage, expansion of voting rights. So how do you know if you're in the middle of a movement, whether it dabbles on the edge of revolution or whether it's just within the banks of the stream, so to speak?
well, certainly we can see that the true testament to revolutions is time. With time, things that really sets apart revolutions from reform. I would say that the certain passing of amendments and ratifications wouldn't be considered more revolutions, more as reform. We can look specifically to the civil rights movement, which I would consider revolution, which included civil revolt and there was change in political power and gave consent to a demographic that had not renewed consent for a demographic that had been oppressed for generations.
And I'd argue that
What
reformation,
fundamental principle, which is the characteristic of a revolution, is embodied in the civil rights movement?
sovereignty and representation, especially, because we can look to the Voting Rights Act of 1964, which enacted pre-clearance for formerly discriminatory states to help enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, as the South was violating these rights in the Jim Crow laws.
And I would
So
disagree
why
with
isn't that
my
a reform to recognize a principle or to embody a principle? Stay with it, Christian.
May you rephrase that?
Why isn't expanding sovereignty and representation to disenfranchised peoples part of a reform to achieve those two pre-existing principles?
Well, I'd argue that it is a reform and that it's a building on these revolutionary principles, because as I stated before, the promissory note of the Declaration promised equal rights and protections for all. And this is a furthering of an evolution. I see reforms as an evolution of these revolutionary principles and continuations, especially through the amendment process.
I would also like to add that I disagree with my colleagues that I think the amendment process and expanding consent is actually revolutionary, because I believe that Thomas Jefferson's principle that the Constitution or the tree of liberty must be watered by the blood of its people, I think that that's an outdated concept when it comes to revolutions. And I think that for me, the principle of revolution is changing where power lies. And when you pass these amendments like the 19th Amendment and the 15th Amendment that give voting rights to people that did not previously have them, I think that that is revolutionary.
So, Rush, so there's no end to the American Revolution. Rush is correct.
I would argue that there isn't. No, it's a furthering of this revolution itself, a reformation and evolutions.
So Rush also argued that morals and manners have to change along with revolutionary principles. How do you see morals and manners changing?
We can look at this in respect to the human condition reflected through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where behaviors such as this go from a need for protection and survival under a general sovereign to carry out our general will, to evolving to more esteem and social needs, where our manners change because we have different appetites and aversions, as Thomas Hobbes believed in, which guide us away or to certain stimuli.
Okay. In your life today, in current day America, where do you see your civic responsibility in terms of widening consent or making sure that it exists?
I would see my role as a student is just participating in programs such as the We the People program, and just overall trying to have a push for more education to instill civic education and civic responsibility to students from a young age, because that's where I feel that we lack most, and that is where most change will happen if we teach citizens from a young age the importance of our government and civic responsibility and virtue.
I would also like to add that something that we are facing today is voter restrictions and ways that the government passes certain laws that try to restrict votes. For example, I think that something that we have to be conscious of is voter ID laws, because in 2008, over 2 million people were required to have voter ID laws to vote, and they did not have them. And I think that if we're aware of these issues and we can push using the processes of initiative, referendum, and recall, we can, or I just guess initiative and referendum, we can really expand consent for everyone.
Should there be a national initiative and referendum?
We passed time, Sue.
Oh.
Yeah.
Nod or shake your heads.
All right, very good. I think you guys had a very wide terrain and a finesse and ease with a really a large lens that you took, not just the past, but also was the first presentation I've heard. I judged Unit 1 yesterday, the day before also. It's the first time I've heard social media come up, and frankly, I think it's absolutely critical. I was impressed with your reference to Rebecca McKinnon's book, Consent of the Network, to the idea of digital due process, the threat from technology companies and these social media platforms to consent, but then also how they widen the terrain for and possibility, opportunity for people to express that. I think looking into the future, I think this is where the battlegrounds are going to be, quite frankly, both the threats and the opportunities. You have a lot to be proud of. Pleasure to listen to you.
Yeah, there was a couple of things that struck me about this presentation. First of all, we've done, I don't know, maybe thousands of these hearings over the years. First time I've ever heard Maslow. And I think you're onto something you're on the verge of absolute brilliance here, that maybe just going beyond protection to more things that relate to human dignity would be possibly influence our morals and manners into what we value in our system. And I'd urge you to think about that, because I think you were articulating the idea of maybe human dignity ought to drive our social contract more than just sheer protection. And I think that's very insightful, and I'd urge you to continue thinking about that. I'm going to get a little grumbly on. I'd like to hear a little bit more about early state constitutions. I mean, you did mention Pennsylvania and Delaware, but a bit more of the history there in those first post-war, or even sometime during the war, constitutions, I think would have bolstered your argument a little bit better there. But I mean, you stuck to your guns on this idea of sovereignty and power. and I appreciated that. So thank you very much. And you've got a great teacher in Mr. Hyams. Enjoy your time with him.
Exactly. You may look back on the best years of your life being this year with Milt Hyams in terms of understanding civics and civic responsibility and so on. That was a very engaging I am struck by your starting with Madison's Federalist 14, suggesting that the revolution was over before the Constitutional Convention, which means the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was a tinkering exercise. It was a plumbing or an engineering challenge, not an intellectual challenge. Surprised that you didn't refer to limited government as one of the fundamental principles at the outset, but by the time you're done with your presentation, it's not a surprise at all, because you're advocating, I think as Tim pointed out, a very different way of looking at the relationship between citizen and government, not so much as government is something that stands at arm's length and gives us the right to be here unfettered in the private sphere, to government having an affirmative duty to meet our human needs. And that could be the really fun challenge of your generation. Going back even as far as Aristotle, he points out the challenges that technology create for human beings, and warned that as soon as we become more concerned in how things work than why they work, we will fundamentally alter the human personality and the human experience. And that's what I think you're suggesting social media is doing today. How do we get on top of that? Do we care why? And where's the best way to address that concern with the why we're doing what we're doing with this technology? Fascinating notions. I hope you're looking are going to buy Putnam's newest book, because he's come up, he thinks, with a remedy to bowling alone, which I'm really looking forward to seeing. Very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.